And there are, this is not a matter of first impression as to how the conflict of laws work, but it is a matter of first impression probably if it relates to testing the domestic asset protection jurisdictions as they pertain to self-settled trusts. So I may be telling you more than you want to know about this, but you can see why some people are inclined, though, to consider foreign or offshore asset protection trusts, is that they look at the situation domestically and they can see that there's some uncertainty, and they don't want to live with that uncertainty. Even though, incidentally, it's much more convenient to form a domestic trust. You're not dealing with lawyers and people that you may know little about in these other jurisdictions, and you're spending less money. So it is attractive to do a domestic asset protection trust, and quite frankly, I tend to think that these laws will be upheld. I do think that when they're tested, that we'll see that these new jurisdictions will be enforced. I think that's the trend of the future. But for those of you who have reservations about that, I mean, clearly the safest and much better settled law exists in these foreign jurisdictions. There are some that have been around many years, some that are relatively new. But there are a variety of them out there. There are a number of jurisdictions in the Caribbean, the Isle of Man. There are a variety of places you can go, and some of them have advantages over others. You can talk that through with somebody who does a significant amount of asset protection planning with offshore trusts. But you really need to talk to a firm that focuses on that, not somebody who just dabbles in it, because it really is a very complex area, and it requires the full-time attention virtually of a lawyer. So that's the issue of forming trusts. They're critical. While they're a little complicated, they're hugely important. You need to think about it. You can do it domestically. You can do it with offshore. What else should we talk about? We talk about asset protection. I guess I will mention the idea of title. You can transfer assets between you and others and make them inaccessible to claimants, to creditors. Now, again, this is subject to those fraudulent conveyance rules I mentioned earlier. So you can't do these conveyances when these claimants already exist, or when you have reason to expect them. But assuming that there is not a fraudulent conveyance, you can transfer assets to others. Now you can see where that is fraught with many risks. I mean, you're surrendering ownership, you're surrendering control. What about the liability of this other person? I mean, there's all sorts of questions associated with transferring assets to others. I mention it because it's something that some people do. I mean, if the circumstances are right, you certainly can't categorically say, no lawyer can categorically say that's always a bad idea. It may be the perfect solution for you, but you don't want to do it without considering the tax consequences and the other asset protection consequences as they pertain to the other person. But it's not uncommon to have somebody who's a business person who lives with a great deal of risk. Maybe it's somebody who's a doctor. They practice in an area where malpractice rates are very high. They may think that it makes sense to transfer an asset to a family member that they would have transferred eventually anyway. This is somebody whose judgment they trust, who doesn't have the risk factors around them in their life that exist in his. That the tax consequences can be avoided, and that's a discussion that you have to have with your tax attorney at that time, or your estate planning attorney. And many of these things, incidentally, are captured under the rubric of estate planning. Not a lot of lawyers call themselves asset protection lawyers. There are a few, and again, these are kind of an elite few who focus primarily on these forming domestic and offshore trusts. But for the most part, that's captured under estate planning. So estate planning lawyers engage in virtually all the considerations that we've talked about here today, but more as they relate to trusts and these transfers that I mentioned, rather than the contractual issues. But they certainly do form entities regularly, and they know the consequences of those because they do tie in fundamentally with the issue of estate planning. So estate planning is really a very broad topic, and some define it in such a way to include asset protection. But I just want you to be aware that retitling assets can be huge. If you're married and you have assets in joint names, depending on the jurisdiction, it can form a tenancy by the entirety. Tenancy by the entirety is sometimes impregnable from creditors, which means that creditors can't access those assets if you own them in that form, or they can't access the other spouse's portion. So if you're married, there's some opportunity for asset protection there that you want to think about. But then another piece of that is, what are the implications in the event of a divorce? So you have to weigh those. And so if I have clients who've been married 5 years, my answer to that might be a little different from if I have clients who've been married 25 years. So it's very driven by the facts. But I just mentioned it in the efforts of having a laundry list that's fairly complete here. So we've moved quickly. We've just done an overview to some extent of these considerations, but it's good things for you to think about and have put before you toward the end of the year. Maybe this will stimulate you to get this done as your first priority for 2009, if not sooner. So a laundry list real quickly. We talked about risk management. Could have said a whole lot more about that, but risk management remembers the discussion of insurance as well as avoiding insurance, in other words, self-insurance. Talked about minimizing risk. Entities, remember, you've got to be operating in an entity. That's probably the most reckless, irresponsible thing a businessman can be doing right now is not being in a proper entity. Title considerations, just touched on that briefly, but at least it calls your attention to it. Trust, the domestic, the offshore, and then finally contracts. Think about the contracts of your life. There are a lot of them that you probably haven't even noticed, and some of them you can influence the level of risk associated to you in the event things go wrong. Well, with that, I'll conclude. I wish you a Merry Christmas, a Happy Hanukkah, a wonderful New Year, and I look forward to your joining me on the next show. Take care. This is Joe Cordell with Cash Counsel.